I'm so glad that you're here watching this. Grief is not a sexy topic. It's something that we push to the margins of our culture. And the 5 gates of grief that I'm going to be talking about today, only one of them is really acknowledged in our culture. And we are all carrying around so much undigested grief. And I believe that this is one of the things that we are misdiagnosing as anxiety and depression and just this feeling of emptiness and this feeling of not belonging. And it drags us down. And since it's misdiagnosed, we're not really having the right medicine. And we're just coping with antidepressants, with Netflix, with, beer, whatever your way of coping is. Nothing wrong with those things. We need them to take some of the edge off. But what we really need is for the grief to move through us. And in more mentally healthy cultures, there are grief rituals held monthly. Because grief is meant to be shared in community, and it's one of the things that we all go through, all of us. And so it's something that really makes sense to do as a village, as a community. And we don't have very many spaces where we get to do this. So a lot of what I'm going to be sharing today, in fact, the 5 gates of grief, are from Francis Weller's book. If you haven't read him, I highly recommend checking out his book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow. It's beautifully written. In fact, some of the phrasing that I'm going to be using is just taken directly from the book, because he has such an eloquence for describing the shape of these wounds and describing the life of the soul. It's not easy to do. So without further ado, I would love to dive into the first gate of grief. And so I think this will probably be about a half an hour. And be sure to stick around to the end. I promise I'll be telling you about ways I can support you further. And in particular, a grief ritual coming up this Sunday that's just open to the community. And it's going to be a salve for a lot of what I talk about today. So, the first gate of grief is the one that we do recognize in our culture, and that is that everything we love, we will lose. And so I'm talking about people and things. Animals fall into this category. Places fall into this category. Illness falls into this category. Having an able body. And I often say grief is akin to praise. It's how we honor what we've loved. And it's so important to feel those feelings. In fact, many cultures believe that our tears are required to send the spirit off to the other side. And even though this is a type of grief that we do acknowledge in our culture, I don't have to tell you that we don't really know how to grieve it. Those of you who have been through a major loss know that most people just really don't know what to say, and they really don't know how to hold it. We don't have great training for this. The one space we have, a funeral or a memorial service, it happens so soon, often when people are still in shock. And how many of you have been to a funeral or a memorial service that just, like, you couldn't even shed a tear? Or maybe you were able to cry a little bit at points, but it's not really a space where, most often, where we are encouraged to really, let it rip, which is what we need to do. And so we kind of do it alone, and that's not how we're meant to grieve. So really we need multiple ongoing grief rituals And yeah, and we need to find these communities that can really hold the pain. And so that's one of the things I am really passionate about doing, is creating these rituals where, all of that is welcome, where all of those feelings are welcome, where you can really, really feel it. And having a sequencing that helps people drop into those emotions, because many of us are very defended against it, especially if there's multiple losses. It's like there's this fear that dam grows, and then you just like let a little bit of feeling loose, and the whole structure is threatened. And behind that one grief, lo and behold, there's another grief. So it can be kind of threatening to open up that dam, but the only way to get back to your joy, to get back to your creativity and your aliveness, is to go through that, because you cannot selectively numb. Once you start putting some things on the side of that dam, you're putting all of your feelings there. You're putting so much of your life there. And so we need these rituals to just open up that dam. And the more often you can do it, the less that's going to be built up. So it gets less scary over time. So I want to move on, because the other 4 gates, you will recognize them, but you probably couldn't name them on your own. And the second gate is the places that have not known love. And so these are the places within us that are wrapped in shame, and they're banished to the far shores of our existence. They're the parts of us that we've deemed unlovable. Robert Bly has a great description of, we come into this world, these orbs of light, this 360-degree orb of light. If you see a 1-year-old toddling around, they're just glowing with like every single emotion and way of being, and then we get taught by our families and by the culture at large that parts of that are not acceptable. And some of this is okay. I love one of the examples Robert Bly gives is, lo and behold, you learn that it's rude to try to kill your brother. So there's some things that, some ways we get shaped that are really good. And then there's some things that we pick up from our family and teachers and the culture at large that are really discouraged. And I work with shame a lot, especially in Wild Women Rising. And so I'm familiar with these categories, one of the main categories is around sexuality and our bodies. There's a lot to say about that. People have really strong feelings about what's okay and what's not okay about your naked body and how you express your sexuality. I've heard lots of stories about, parents discovering masturbation at an early age, and then parental response to that. Sometimes your joy and exuberance gets slivered away. So Robert Bly talks about the shadow bag, so then it's like, okay, well, that's going in the shadow bag. Or another way of talking about it is like you kind of get slivered until you just have this slice left. Sometimes it's anger or sadness. If you're a woman, it's more typically anger. I mean, every family's different, but more typically, anger goes in the shadow bag. And if you're a man, this one makes me so incredibly sad. It's your sadness, that you're not allowed to fucking cry. Like, what a fucked up thing to do to a person is to tell them it's not okay to cry. Oh, it makes me so mad. And then also our needs that were ignored, better put those in the shadow bag. And so oftentimes, all this stuff that goes through in the shadow bag, it kind of pops up in the form of addictions, depression, anxiety, and they're calling out for our attention. So we end up with these little slivers of who we are. And so we cannot grieve these things because they're deemed outside the circle of worth, you know, and oftentimes, I mean, the definition of a shadow bag is this stuff you can't see, it's your shadow. So the cure involves making a switch from contempt to seeing ourselves as wounded, to having a little bit of distance and holding that part of ourselves with compassion. And then the step after that is then being able to talk to someone that you trust. And it has to be someone you trust, because you will get re-wounded if you don't tell the right person. But talk with someone that you trust about these parts of yourself, because it's only when we can start to hold them with compassion that we can grieve them. And then there is a river of grief, because in these parts is a lot of our aliveness, you know. It's the whole breadth of our human experience, you know. So if you have anger in there, you're walking around crippled. If you have sadness in there, oh my goodness, your exuberance. So that's a lot of the reason of our lack of vitality in this kind of flatline culture, is so much is in that shadow bag. So when we bring it out and we go through that long process of being able to hold it with compassion, and then being able to love it, or at least accept it, and then welcome it back home, then there's grief, because you did that to yourself, you know. So you have to have a lot of compassion for yourself, and just grieving all the time that you've lived without this part of your human experience. And so this is a lot of what I do in individual counseling, and it's a long journey, and it's so worth doing. I miss doing this live. I mean, I know some of you are watching this after the fact, but I really miss being with you live. All right. There's a lot more I want to say about that. I guess a plug for if you don't do this work, and you probably have some people in your life that you've seen kind of get to, there's really a crossroads at midlife where the shadow bag kind of starts to assert itself, and you have a choice. And the longer you wait, the harder it is. And sometimes people get to a point where it is kind of too late, where it's just too much, and it's a type of soul loss. And you know these people by their lack of joy and passion and aliveness, you know, by their decreased capacity for wonder and awe. And it just saps your voice and your courage and your desire to live. And it takes a lot of courage to welcome some of these things back home. In Wild Woman Rising, we do something called the Loyal Soldier, and there's these parts of us that have stood in as soldiers to keep us safe. And, you know, they're the ones who are saying, okay, put that in the shadow bag, put that in the shadow bag. You know, we have to be loved, we have to be accepted. And when we get older, we have a lot more choice about how we want to be and who we want to be with. And we can find these pockets of counterculture, or these friendships, people who accept us as we are. And so we go through this process of discovering the loyal soldier and conversing with the loyal soldier and telling him or her that the war is over and it's okay to step into our authenticity and really have a lot more colors in our paint box for how we want to be in the world. Okay, so much more to say. I mean, this is like psychotherapy in a nutshell, but we still have 3 more gates of grief. So I want to move on to, this is probably the one I cry about the most. So this one is the sorrows of the world. And now we're tapping into the final three are really tapping into our communal and shared grief. And this is what cellist Glendinning, I don't know how to pronounce her last name, Glendinning, calls earth grief. And this is about our losing of the honeybees, the grizzly bears, the monarch butterflies, whole human languages and cultures, clear cuts, polluted rivers, oceans, air, fires, mudslides, hurricanes, floods, roadkill, the destruction and the diminishment and the taming of the wild spaces. We are destroying our home. And it takes everything we have to numb these sorrows out. They're always in the background, and we're always numbing them out. And it is our spiritual responsibility to acknowledge these losses. We know and we feel in our bones that something is amiss. Our extended homes being eroded, and with it, our experience of our wider self. And it's good manners. I love this. This is Francis Weller. It is good manners to respond with sorrow, outrage, and apology. And we're depleting the complex, multi-layered song of the world and replacing it with a single-pitched monotone. It's estimated that we lose dozens of species a day. And it's estimated that from 30 to 50% of all species could possibly be extinct by the middle of the century. And every few weeks, a whole human language is lost. And along with it, a nuanced imagination and way of seeing the world that was rooted in a place and a people for perhaps thousands of years. Every week, one of these is disappearing. And then along with this loss of our home is a loss of our connection with nature. We no longer live with a sensuous intimacy with the wind, the rivers, rainfall, and birdsong. Thomas Berry says we've become autistic to the world. And here's a quote from Paul Shepard. The grief and sense of loss that we often interpret as a failure in our personality is actually a feeling of emptiness, where a beautiful and strange otherness should have been encountered. And so we're not having these daily encounters with ferns and redwoods, with scrub jays and madrone trees, maybe scrub jays, with hawks and bobcats, and lupin and mountain misery, and it leads to this grief-laden emptiness. We're meant to be in conversation. We're meant to embody a vivid and animated life, to live close to our wild souls and our wild bodies. We're meant to dance and sing and laugh and play and tell stories around a fire under the stars at night. Here's Francis Weller again. The wild within and the wild without are kin, the one enlivening the other in a beautiful tango. And another great book is Richard Louve's The Last Child in the Woods. He talks about nature deficit disorder. And I would love to see that put in the DSM, because what are the effects of this, And we talk about, there's all sorts of research now on forest bathing. And, I've started to carve out in my schedule 2 days a month where I just go out into nature. And it's so replenishing. But this is supposed to be every day, You know, it's not supposed to be this go out and do thing. It's supposed to be interwoven into every day. And without this, there's this feeling that we don't belong. And we make it up that we don't belong because there's something wrong with us. And if we can only fix the thing that's wrong with us, then we'd finally get that sense of belonging. And we were born, the truth is we were born belonging. And that's what the natural world tells us. But we don't get to hear that message every day anymore. And it leads to this profound loneliness and isolation that we don't acknowledge. There's a conversation with a Stellar J right now. And we've just normalized this as the modern condition. And so a lot of these things, there's not a cure. And in fact, the Indo-European root of the word cure means something like to feel your sorrows. So actually, the cure is to feel your sorrows. I don't know if any of you have had this experience. I talk about it a lot with folks who are grieving, is that if you let yourself feel the grief, like really feel it all the way through, which can be hard if you have a lot built up. I don't know what's going on with this angelic light over there. It's not anything to do with me. I'm trying to fix it, but you come out the other side laughing. I've had these grief groups where people are just laughing hysterically. So, but you got to go through all the feelings. So the cure actually is to acknowledge and feel this sadness. So let's take a deep breath. So gate number 4 is what we expected and did not receive. So deep in our bones, we were born, we were wired with this expectation that we were going to come out into the world and we were going to be met with 40 pairs of eyes looking at us, expecting us. And we were expecting a certain quality of welcome and engagement, touch and reflection, being deeply seen and celebrated. And it's what Francis Weller, he calls deep time ancestors. It's what our deep time ancestors experienced as their birthright. And what I'm talking about is the container of the village. And we feel this fog of grief for this. It's unnamed. It's unnamed. And here's the conundrum, is that we need the village to grieve this. We're just yearning for this village. And yet, to grieve this thing that we don't have, we need the village to help us grieve it. So it's unnamed until you have it. And some of you, I wish this was Facebook Live so I could ask, have you had the experience of it? Maybe at a festival. I haven't been to Burning Man, but maybe at Burning Man. Retreats, workshops. It's what I try to create in my groups. It's one of the reasons I'm so passionate about groups is you get to create the village, even if it's only for 6 months. And hopefully it continues beyond that. But I love creating these countercultures where we get to experience what we're meant to experience. That kind of belonging and acceptance and authenticity and being seen. And so when we finally have that experience, it rushes over us, this knowing of like, oh, this is how it's meant to be. And in that moment, there's grief. We go to this folk festival, the Kerrville Folk Festival. Oh, it's so lovely. We fly all the way to Texas to go there. We haven't gone the last 2 years, so we just miss it. But there's just music. Everyone's making music with each other, and there's this, that sense of community. If you've been to a festival, you know what I'm talking about. And there are signs everywhere, all these handmade signs, and one of the main messages is it could always be like this. I think that's the gift of a festival, is it's just like, hey, there's this other way, and then you get back into the default world, and it's really sad. I don't know if you've had that experience of coming back from a festival and you're still saying hi to everyone on the street, and they're kind of looking at you like, we don't say hi to each other. And you're still letting your freak flag fly, and you're like, oh yeah, I gotta put that freak flag away. But, yeah, we're missing that. And we experience this not belonging again as this personal failure, but it's really a societal failure. Yeah. Francis Wellers describes going to a village in West Africa, Burkina Faso. Those of you who know Malidoma Somé, who does amazing grief rituals. I haven't been to one, but I'd love to go to one. That's where he's from, and they have regular grief rituals all the time. And he described, at the end of the day, everyone comes together, and everyone, I guess, is breastfeeding each other's kids, and they're talking about their day, and they're laughing. And I've had similar experiences like this, living cooperatively in a home, that all coming together at the end of the day. Or maybe if you have a big enough family, it feels like this. But, just like everyone together, sort of under one roof. And I remember coming back, spent a lot of time in Central and South America, and coming back and just feeling so sad. I mean, those of you who've spent time abroad, it's always the coming home that is the biggest culture shock. I remember thinking it was so weird, like walking down the street and then you don't say hi to someone. I was like, what? Because there it's just like, buenos dias, buenas tardes. You always say hello. And then just like one person in each car, and these like little separate isolated bubbles, and just so sad. Is this culture here, the general culture? I know it's not for everyone, but I know there are pockets that aren't this way, but it is lonely ass culture. So another component of this gate of grief is purpose. That deep in our bones, we have this intuition that we come here with this bundle of gifts to offer our community. And over time, these gifts are meant to be seen and developed and called into the village in times of need. It's our spiritual employment. And many of us don't have that mentorship to help us find the gifts and uncover them. And also, to get the gifts out, it requires authenticity. And to have authenticity, you have to deal with a lot of these other gates of grief, specifically the second gate of all that's in your shadow bag. So we lack this sense of being deeply seen and needed, needed for that special bundle of gifts, not needed in the way of like, I'm going to be Superwoman because, I love having people need me, and, or don't love having people need me, but, just that this is my bundle. This is what makes me so unique. Yeah. So again, the cure is to face the emptiness. That facing the emptiness is the cure to our freedom. And, finding and creating these countercultures that are more village-like. We're working on it in my neighborhood, and it just feels so much better, especially if you raise kids. Oh my God, it's so much better in a village. But I want to move on because I said 30 minutes and we're at about 30. So the fifth gate is ancestral grief. And this is a little bit complicated because there's a few things I'm going to be talking about here. It's the grief that we carry in our bodies from the sorrows experienced by our ancestors. So most of us in this country arrived here leaving our families, our communities, our traditions, our languages, our rituals, all of it. And others who are here arrived here abducted into slavery. And those of us who were here had traditions, forbidden and beaten out of us. So, and so many, maybe everyone in this country, I don't want to make a blanket statement, but there's a surviving without a feeling of home. That the traditions that had nourished our ancestors for hundreds, maybe even thousands of years, then, in the course of a couple lifetimes, it's just gone, it's cut off, and then become replaced with these strategies to survive, alcoholism, restricting or hiding the full range of affect or who they were, so that they could blend in and assimilate to survive. And there are also specific family legacies of trauma that get passed on. All the past trauma, all the unprocessed grief, all the work that, our mothers, our grandmothers, our great-grandmothers, our great-great-grandmothers, and then again on the patriarchal side, all of that, anything that didn't get processed and worked through, gets passed on experientially, but also it's in our bones, it's in our DNA, it's in our bones. And these stories and these experiences live inside of us. And we hold this grief, this ancestral grief, in our beings as this layer of heaviness. Martin Prechtel, also a beautiful writer, he says, we are surrounded by the ghosts of our unwept ancestors. It's another reason to do your grief work. You won't be fucking up your grandchildren. And so this is soul work, and it needs to be done on a soul level. Talk therapy cannot touch this. So the language of the soul is ritual. In this category also is included the abuses, to millions of individuals. And again, this is a category I could just go on and on. The Holocaust, genocide of indigenous cultures, killing fields of Cambodia, atomic bombs, way too much to name. And the grief is so immense, it's hard to reconcile. And this long shadow of violence persists in our psyches. And it generates this persistent hum of sorrow in the background of our lives. And finally, also included in this category is the loss of our connection with our ancestors. And this is not true of everyone, but most folks, maybe not most folks I know, because I know a lot of witches, but most folks don't no longer look to their ancestors as a connection to the invisible spirit world. That is a lost connection. Yeah. Not to mention the loss of rituals, stories, songs, land, language. My favorite holiday in Bolivia is Todos Santos. It happens on the 2nd of November. Yeah. And everyone, I don't know why, but they make these tantawawas, these like bread babies. I don't know what that's about, and these huge elaborate picnics of the food that the deceased love. And everyone goes to the cemetery and has picnics on the graves. And they drink chicha and they pour it on the graves. And there's this connection, right? And you have your pictures that you bring of the people you lost. But you're all there in the cemetery. Like, everyone's there together. It's a party. Like, who can do that? Who can go to one cemetery with your whole village and you're all there together and everyone you've lost is together and you're all there on the same day acknowledging them? You know, we don't have that place. We don't have a place where the bones lie. We don't have that ongoing conversation again with the invisible. So, if you have made it this far, I am in deep gratitude for you for doing this work, because it's work, you know, it's work to feel this. But it's way more work to not feel it, and you are harming yourself and the people around you and future generations by not doing this work. So, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Bye.